welcome to this very first live I'm doing here. I will be addressing questions to ask yourself if you're considering leaving your relationship, if you're currently having doubts, if you're currently wondering what the next step is, and you're confused. Today's video was really inspired by a lot of requests on Instagram from people who are having doubts. And I thought I'd share about this specific topic because that's also something that I struggled with in the past, in my now 15-year relationship with my husband, Dennis. And if you're coming from Instagram, you know about our ups and our downs, you know about when we had doubts, but I never really shared very specific questions that I would have loved to ask myself when we were in doubts, and questions that I typically would recommend that you ask yourself if you're in that situation and in that in between. You might be currently experiencing challenges, maybe differences, and there's so much that can happen in a relationship. So of course, it's very common to have doubts. So I hope that today's video will address some of the essential questions that you can ask yourself so that you can more confidently define your next steps and go, what can I do about this situation? If you're new here or you're new on my social media channels, I'm Alex. I'm a life and relationship coach, and I help both couples and individuals live a healthier, happier life and love life specifically. So this specific channel will be all about providing educational content, debunking myths. If you're on Instagram, you know I do that a lot, offering insights that I wish I knew sooner, and even some sneak peeks from my now 15-year relationship, a little bit of the behind the scenes. So very excited to kick this off. I will say that just as a disclaimer, and as with any relationship advice that you ever hear, whether it's from family, friends, the internet, me, really take into account context. How is your situation? What is going on in your relationship? Really important to know that no relationship is black or white. There's a lot of gray space, gray area, a lot of nuances, and every situation, every relationship, every partner is different. So whatever I'm going to share today, please go, how does this apply to me? So I'll give you general guidelines and specific questions, practical questions that you can ask yourself. But I'd always recommend to go, how does this also apply to me in the context that I am in the situation that I am in? Really important, because sometimes we can get sidetracked with information that we hear, and it's not always easy to go and determine what works for us. So I hope that these questions will give you clarity, and without further ado, let's get started. All right. So first things first, I want to start with the very first thing that you do want to make sure if you are considering leaving your relationship or are considering staying in your relationship is, are we both willing to make this work if we were to give it another chance? And I'm saying willing because willingness is really important. We can't force our partner who has maybe checked out to stay in the relationship, just like it is a conscious choice from our side to stay in a relationship, maybe rebuild trust, maybe learn to do things differently, maybe handle conflict differently. If we choose to stay, that becomes a choice, but it does have to be something that we're both committed to, we're both willing. And I say this first of all because whatever I'm going to say next assumes that you are willing to be open to the option of continuing and you're willing to see what you can do about it. But first things first is, are we both willing to make it work? And I was mentioning about a partner, for example, being checked out or not being willing to make it work. That's a tricky situation because, as one of my mentors says, is we can't be more ambitious for someone than they are ambitious for themselves. Meaning we can't force someone to be motivated to put in effort. We can't force someone to make change if they're not willing to make changes. So that's the first thing, is how willing are we to even put in more effort in this relationship? And that is from my side, but also my partner's side. We can always have conversations about willingness and, Why is there resistance there? I'm not saying it's a black or white thing. And I'm not saying, if my partner is not willing, then that's it, we're done. That's not the point. The point is to say, how willing are we? And if we are not, or if there's some doubt there, can we clarify that first? Can we make sure that we're both willing to at least put in the effort if we're going to put in more effort? And again, knowing that we can't be more ambitious for someone than they are for themselves. We do need a sense of agency from both sides. And then we can start to ask ourselves, do we want similar things? And I do not believe that you have to be similar in order to make it work. If you've been following me on Instagram, for example, you know that Dennis and I are very different in our personalities, in our interests, in our communication styles, in our hobbies. But you do want to make sure that the fundamental differences are being addressed. Fundamental differences can look like wanting something casual versus wanting something long-term and something serious. Fundamental difference can look like one of you wants kids and the other doesn't. One of you wants to get married at some point and the other is just like, that's a no-go. So that is something that you do want to look at in terms of do we have a similar vision? It's not like we have to have every single thing figured out, but at least the fundamentals, do we have a similar idea of where this relationship is heading and what we want in the future? And that is one of the most important things as a couple, is to know, are we in this together and are we seeing a similar vision in the future? And this also helps to answer the question, are we compatible or not? Compatibility is this nuanced area, as I always say, because whether we are compatible or not really depends on, are we willing to accept certain differences? What are we willing to accept? What are we not willing to accept? What are our deal breakers? And that really depends on every couple. What I, for example, would find acceptable is maybe not what you would find acceptable, and vice versa. And so compatibility is very subjective in a way, and it comes down to these fundamental differences. If I want kids and Dennis does not want kids, or vice versa, then that's a big topic. That's a topic that we do want to make sure that we are more or less aligned on if we want to make it work. And that is something that I've seen couples work around, kind of go, well, let's give each other a timeline. Let's see how things evolve. Again, it's a question of, what are we willing to accept when we have differences? Can we find an agreement? Are we willing to accept something where we are fundamentally different? It can be. Or are certain things a deal breaker and considering leaving is actually very legit? So that's another bucket of questions that I would recommend asking yourself. And maybe to give you a little bit of background, Dennis and I, for example, were not on the same page when it came to when we would get engaged and next steps. So that was always a topic for years and years and years. It was like, we're not on the same page. I want to get engaged and married earlier, and he saw things very differently. And so it came to the point where we really had to have these big conversations around, well, how do we still see things? Do you still believe in marriage? Do you still believe in getting engaged? And that was not the question. That was starting to become more and more clear that that is what we wanted, but it's just in terms of timeline that it wasn't working out the way I wanted it to work out. And so that was a question that I had to ask myself. Am I willing to stick to this relationship, although I might not get engaged as quickly as I thought, married as quickly as I thought? And it was a big, big question. We did reach an agreement and we said, all right, can we check in after a certain amount of years, how we're doing, and understand why there is resistance as to the timeline. And we did long distance, so there was a lot of different things, but it did come to these really important conversations that we did want to have to define the vision, the future that we saw together. Same for kids, not kids. I mean, it's a big topic. If I want kids and he doesn't, or vice versa, that's something that we want to avoid having resentment over if one has to dismiss or compromise on things that they're not willing to compromise. So it's important to go, what do we want? And are we aligned on at least the big things? And if we're not, are we willing to accept differences? Can we find agreements? Or has this become a deal breaker? I remember asking Dennis, kids, great, I'm willing to have them. He's willing to have them. But right now I'm not willing. Right now I'm not ready. I just don't feel ready. There are other priorities in my life. Is that okay for you? And we agreed on, yes, that's okay. And I remember telling him, but what if I cannot have kids? It could be. Would that still be okay with you? And he went, yeah, that's okay. But if I can, we will have kids. So it was those conversations to have, because you don't want to be there and go, actually, we want totally different things and we're not willing to compromise, we're not willing to agree, we're not willing to accept each other's differences. And that can be some big topics to put on the table first. So do we want similar things, especially on the fundamental differences that we have? Can we find agreements? And do we see at least a similar future together? That's a big, big thing to discuss. Then there is, in that bucket, before I wrap that up, let's say differences on a day-to-day. When it comes to, for example, differences in personalities or sleeping habits, communication styles, all of those things, those are things that can be worked on. Again, if you're willing to make it work. Dennis and I have very different sleeping habits, and not everyone would be willing to accept that. I know couples who would say, no, that's a deal breaker. So you want to really notice what is important to me, what is important to us, where does it come to deal breakers, and where can we find a bridge so that we know at least where we're heading. The third big question that I would recommend asking yourself is, if we're willing to make things work, if we have at least a similar idea of where we want to be headed, now we want to make sure that we're putting our efforts in the right place. So the question is, where are we putting our efforts if we're making efforts? And I love to see a relationship as a game where every couple gets to define their own rules to the game. And the question comes down to, like, what needs to happen for us to make it work and to win at it? What would need to happen for us to lose at it? So what really needs to happen for us to make it work, and specifically to this relationship? Every relationship is unique, and the biggest mistake that I see people make is making efforts but kind of missing the mark. And I love to also think of it like a target where everyone has specific needs. Everyone has, if you know about love languages, their own preferred way of feeling loved. And that's the target. And many people try to love someone a certain way, try to put efforts in a relationship a certain way, and they miss the mark because it's not exactly what someone needs. And so when we want to make efforts and want, for example, a relationship to work, or at least give it a chance and see where it takes us, I do recommend to really define what is it that we each need in this relationship to even make it work, because that will look very differently from one partner to the other. And there is this saying that we should treat others the way we want to be treated, but actually we want to treat others the way they want to be treated, and express how we want to be treated so someone has the chance to meet us halfway. And so again, you can go to the tool called Love Languages. I have a masterclass on that if you want to dive deeper in that, or go, what do we each need? Because people don't leave a relationship when their needs are being met. So if you think about that, you can go, what needs, for example, are not being met right now? Am I making efforts in my relationship that are not being recognized? Or is my partner, for example, making efforts that I'm not recognizing because I haven't expressed clearly what I needed, or because they think they know what I need and it's not really clear? And I was just discussing with a couple a few days ago in one of my sessions where she was feeling very dismissed and very resentful because in their conversations, he was providing solutions to something that she was maybe complaining about or venting about. And he was like, but I am making all of these efforts. I'm just so fed up and I'm almost thinking of leaving this relationship. And when we looked at it, it was because he was making efforts, but again, not in the right direction. And I told him, your intentions are good, your efforts are there, but they're just not what she needs. And we then went into what she needed. She needed validation, empathy, someone to listen, and not necessarily someone to jump in with solutions or tell her what she did wrong. And that's the way he wants to be treated by someone, very solution-oriented, but in certain situations, that's not what she needs. And so the question is, are we putting our efforts in the right place? Do we know where to put them? And really imagine, let's say, a relationship being a game, so we need to define the rules of the game. And that target that I mentioned before, are we so clear on what needs to happen for us to feel fulfilled, for us to feel safe in this relationship, for us to feel loved? And if you are looking to pinpoint your needs, identify them, be able to express them, for you and your partner, definitely check out the masterclass that I have called Aligning Needs. I'll link a lot of resources in the description. But basically, you want to make sure that you're putting your efforts in the right place, because that's a big, big mistake that I see people make. And it's very exhausting, it's very draining to make efforts and that not being recognized on both sides. So, third question, let's say that big question is, where are we putting our efforts? And do we know where to put our efforts? Are we defining the rules of our game? Next question is, what are my reasons to stay? And from observations and from personal experience, I've seen there are healthy reasons and unhealthy reasons. Healthy reasons would, for example, look like, well, my partner is supportive. They're actually really caring. They're very family oriented, and that's something I value. They're loving and they do make efforts, for example. They're at least willing to make things work, and that really gives me hope. On the unhealthier side would be if I'm acting more out of scarcity. Like, I'll never find anyone else, and that's why I'm sticking to this relationship. Or thinking that things will get better with time and no actions. So I hope that time will just solve things. Or I hope that reaching a relationship milestone will solve a lot of our issues, like getting engaged, having babies. I know I thought that before, and I learned the hard way that getting engaged or getting married didn't really change much. It did give me a high at the beginning, but then reality kicked again. And it was like, if we don't actively address things, then things won't really get better if there are challenges. So, what are my reasons to stay? Is it out of scarcity, like I mentioned before, or is it really because there is a lot that I value in this relationship? And so, you want to ask yourself, is what I'm getting in this relationship worth what I'm not getting? Because no relationship is perfect. No relationship is just smooth all the time. We go through stages. If you've heard of the honeymoon stage, there's another stage called the power struggle phase. If you've been in my masterclasses, you know what they look like. But basically, we go through stages. Emotions fluctuate. On days we get on well with our partner, and on other days we have challenges. And so we do want to see, is what I am getting really worth what I'm not getting? And if I'm not getting something really important, are we actively working on that? So is my reason to stay, let's say, on the healthier side, meaning that I see hope, my partner is a good person, they are loving, they are willing to make things work. So that is something that you do want to consider. What are my reasons to stay? And when Dennis and I were going through our rockiest times, and we did almost break up twice, once at around the 2-3 year mark, and once around like the 5-year mark. That was a big, big crisis for us. We realized that we were going to commit to this relationship and actually stay because we realized that the reasons we were going to leave the relationship could potentially come up in other relationships. For example, miscommunication. For example, differences. For example, unmet needs. So the question was like, do we want to learn how to deal with all of these things in this current relationship, or are we okay with starting over? And so I'll put that in the healthier side because it was a lot about learning and growth and committing to each other and going, let's give this one a try before potentially leaving. And if we see that it doesn't work, then we will give each other, let's say, a timeline, or let's agree on something and let's go, well, if this doesn't work and we really put in all of the effort, then that's it. That might be the end of our story. And that kind of leads me to the next question. So I just mentioned, what are my reasons to stay? And the next question that I would ask myself is, if I knew that similar challenges would come up in another relationship, would I want to learn how to overcome these ones with my current partner? So I just mentioned, in my case, miscommunication, unmet needs, differences that might come up in a different level, different way with someone else, because you are bringing people together who do come with their own baggage, do come with their own differences. And the question was, am I willing, for example, in this situation, am I willing to learn how to bridge differences, communicate better, all of that with this specific person? So will I choose this specific person? I could have gone and done that with someone else. So that was actually a choice to go, do I see myself learning how to overcome challenges with this person if I knew that I would experience similar challenges in a next relationship? All right, so I'm gonna start to come to the last portion of questions. There is a big portion in relationships where we do need to look at how am I showing up in my relationship? That's a big, big question in a sense, and I'll give you sub questions to make it even more practical. How am I potentially influencing this relationship? What is my role in this relationship? What role do I play? How do I show up on a day-to-day basis? There is something that I wish I had understood much earlier, that we are basically the common denominator in all of our relationships. And if we look at it through that lens, we start to see what patterns do I bring to my relationship, meaning how do I show up? How do I communicate? How do I deal with triggers? How do I deal when I'm very upset and big emotions come up? How do I approach differences with someone? Do I have healthy boundaries? Meaning, am I very clear on what I'm willing to tolerate and what I'm not willing to tolerate? Super, super important to also see that every relationship does hold up a mirror, and how we show up and how we respond to situations is a big indicator of how we will also respond in another relationship. And so you want to start seeing, again, going to patterns. It's not that there's something wrong with us if we're not dealing with something in a healthy way, but it's what pattern do I bring? Patterns are something that we can break, is something we can change. To give you an idea, in our relationship when we were at our rockiest times, I used to think Dennis was just too different, that he took me for granted, that he was not making efforts. And that really scared me. I was like, my needs are not being met. And I started to be attracted to other people. And I speak about this on Instagram. I'm going to speak a lot more about it here as well. So definitely stay tuned. But I wish I would have also seen my side of it, and I realized that a bit later, where it was like, how am I actually communicating about my unmet needs? Am I aware of my unmet needs? I used to suppress them. I used to think that my needs didn't really matter or that I didn't want to bother. I would typically avoid conflict. I would think conflict is bad. And so that's the pattern that I was bringing to this relationship. And patterns are behaviors that we repeat. And so that is the baggage that I was going to bring to any other relationship. Yes, another partner might trigger me differently. Yes, a partner might be different. Yes, a partner, all of that. But if I remove that, I do have a certain pattern in this relationship, and patterns are habits. These are our go-to behaviors, our go-to strategies, our go-to coping mechanisms. And so it was time for me to go, how am I showing up in this relationship, and what role am I playing in this relationship? We cannot control our partner. If you think about it, you can't control their behaviors, what they're going to say, their reactions. But there is a lot that we as individuals can influence. And that's why I love also working with individuals, and that's why I continue working with individuals, because based on how you respond to a situation, you might influence the other's response. You might influence the other's reaction. We are able to influence, and I'm not saying control, I'm saying influence, depending on how we choose to respond to a situation. So how am I responding to a situation? How am I choosing to respond? And one of the big things that I remember having to be really clear about myself was what I was accepting and what I was not accepting. Deal breakers versus things that were okay for me in this relationship. And that was really important to get clear on, because that was also going to determine what I chose to accept and what I chose not to accept in this relationship. Also really important to go, what do I need? Am I expressing that? And how open and curious am I about what Dennis, for example, needs and what he would actually need in this relationship? Another important part about the role that we play in relationships is, what do I believe about myself, about partners, about my relationships? Because that influences our actions. What we believe influence what we do. I, for example, used to believe that conflict was bad. So obviously I would avoid conflict, which didn't help me grow in the relationship. And again, this was a pattern that I would bring to another relationship, like I mentioned before. Or I thought that a relationship should be easy and smooth. And so when challenges came up, I was like, well, I might as well go with someone else, because that was what I thought was the best thing to do. I was feeling all of the butterflies with someone else. And so I was like, maybe that's where I should go. But actually, when I looked at it, it was like, but what role am I playing in this relationship? Am I having the hard conversations? Am I speaking up about my needs? Am I very clear on my boundaries, on my deal breakers? How do I communicate when things aren't going well? How do I respond when I'm feeling upset? And so all of these things were part of my patterns, and really, really important to know that these will, in one way or another, show up in any other relationship, guaranteed. Just maybe at different levels, because we might have a different partner. And again, every situation is unique. But in some way, shape, or form, our habits are things that we typically bring into a relationship. And habits can be changed with practice, awareness, all of that. But that's one of the last questions I would recommend you to ask yourself as well is, what role am I playing in this relationship? How do I show up? And if I knew that these were my patterns, if I really start to think about that, reflect on that, and that takes a lot of introspection, right? How am I showing up? Then if I'm showing up like this in this relationship, would I want to stay with this specific partner again and in this specific relationship? If I get triggered a lot by my partner, well, if I knew that I would get triggered in any other relationship, because that's just a fact, relationships trigger us, then would I want to learn how to deal with my triggers in a healthy way with this specific partner in this specific relationship? And that gets to be a choice that you make as well. And it comes down to the way we show up. And I know that was huge as well for me, because I thought that going to a next relationship would solve a lot of the issues, and I forgot to see my role in it and just blamed Dennis for all of our issues, to be honest, and thought that if he would change, then things would be better. But actually, I first had to also look at what I was bringing to the relationship and what patterns I was bringing to the relationship. So as you go into like this introspection as well and self-reflection, do that with kindness, compassion. Sometimes we might go, oh, well, I'm actually avoiding conflict, and we can get frustrated at ourselves. Awareness is one of the first steps in anything, in any growth, in learning anything. We need to be aware of our patterns first in order to be able to change anything. So do that with curiosity, with compassion, with kindness, as you go into what role am I playing. It's not to point fingers at us, but it's to take accountability. And a relationship without accountability, well, you can't really grow if you're not being accountable for how you're showing up. Just like our partners also need to be accountable for how they show up, right? And that goes back to the willingness to make efforts. Where are we putting our efforts in? Knowing what we want for our relationship. And so all of these different questions are really here to guide you as to what you want, what you don't want, your role, your partner's role, the willingness that you both have, and where you're actually putting efforts, and defining where you're going to put your efforts in if you do decide to give it a chance. Now, all of these questions are here to give you some clarity, but I know that if you are at a crossroad and you're like, should I leave or should I stay? There is something really useful that I've found, and again, depends on your answers, of course, to these questions, but it's if you are willing to give your relationship a chance for all of the good reasons and all of, because you've been journaling on these different questions that say, I do recommend to make sure that it's very clear what you concretely are going to do from both sides to make things better, and give yourself a timeline to work on that. Because new habits, new efforts do take practice and time. So not time alone, but actually practice. Any new habit that we want to implement takes practice. So it can be really helpful to give yourself a timeline and go, let's see how we develop this new skill, or how we're able to communicate better if we do this thing, or how things evolve now that we've reached an agreement on XYZ thing, and give ourselves, let's say, 3-6 months to see how this evolves and check in between. That can be really, really helpful to see if there is growth, if there is commitment, if there is, space to learn before making a big decision that can be really, really haunting at times. I know how much sleep I had lost when I was trying to decide, and I wish I would have given myself more like a timeline and gone, can we work on this for let's say 6 months? This is what's really important for me. This is what's really important to you. And can we see where this takes us? And of course, I'm assuming that you've answered the very first question. Is there a willingness? Are we clear on what we want for our relationship? Are we headed more or less in the same direction? And take it from there. So a few last things that I'll leave you with, some last thoughts and insights. The first one is, if there is the willingness, there's a lot that you can do. Not just the intention, but if there is also willingness to make it work and willingness to put in the efforts, willingness to give yourselves time to make things better, to be healthier versions of yourself, to handle things differently, for example, there's a lot that you can do, a lot that you can learn. And we don't come with manuals. I always say this, we don't come with a relationship manual on step by step what we need to do in the specific situation that we're in. So there's a lot of growth and learning that comes in any relationship. So if you're both willing to give this a shot, then there's a lot that you can do, a lot that you can grow with, and a lot that you can learn from. The second is, it's important to look at how you're contributing to a relationship, because we can't control how our partner shows up, but we do have a lot of influence through what we do in our relationship and how we respond to a situation. If I'm, for example, very clear on what my deal breakers are, then that will also influence the relationship. My partner will know, well, if I do this XYZ thing, that I know that it will compromise our relationship. And so it really sets the tone. And I love to speak of standards. We get to set the standards for our relationship and have conversations with our partner on what the rules of our game are. The third is, if we give this relationship another chance, what are we concretely doing? What are the action steps? What are the things that we commit to on each side? It's not only you need to do this, it's also, this is what I'd love to see. Are you willing to make it work? Can we come to an agreement? What do you expect from me? And this is what I'm committed to doing better, for example. So there comes the accountability piece, because time alone isn't enough. If there isn't something concretely being done and being addressed, then time is putting something under the rug, especially if it's something important. Love alone isn't enough. And I've said this over and over again on Instagram, if you're following me there too, is love becomes a choice and requires actions, requires skills. And so just the feeling alone won't be enough, because emotions fluctuate, and that will be the case in any relationship. So again, if we choose to stick in this one, what actions are we taking? And what are we concretely doing? And ultimately, the decision to stay or leave is, of course, up to you. But answering these questions very honestly, hopefully will give you direction and also give you some more clarity, so that you can take your next steps from a place of peace of mind, confidence, rather than anxiety and confusion, since I know that's typically the state that we're in. And so hopefully you can start to get answers by asking yourself these different questions. I will check the comments and see if I can reply to a few questions. Do you ever regret being in a relationship with someone different from you? How did you decide when to have kids? That's a really good question. So I believe that we can learn a lot from being different. And I'm saying this with hindsight, because when you're different, you're like, we're too different sometimes, or it would just be so much easier with someone who's similar. I don't see something wrong with being with someone similar, but I do know that I've grown so much with being with someone different. And so for me, the benefits of being with someone who's just very different has made me grow so much compared to if he were similar. Again, we are similar in certain areas. We do have similar values, but we are different in just so many areas. And so it actually forced us to really find agreements when we chose to stick together and be together. And so in my personal opinion, when you have differences, you have a choice. Either you accept certain differences, you reach agreements, or it becomes a deal breaker. In our situation, we have been able to reach agreements, and we've learned so much from each other by being curious about each other's differences. And I think that's been huge, is unlocking that level of going, wow, we're different, but this is how we can remain close and remain connected and feel like a team despite the differences. That's been like a huge eye-opener for us to be able to unlock, let's say, over the years, and go like, how can we even reach agreements? How can we overcome these differences? Because that's made us stronger. I know maybe that sounds a little bit cringy, but it's true. Differences have made us stronger in a way, because they really force us to look at our differences without becoming enemies because we're different, right? If I have a specific way to communicate and he has a very different way to communicate, well, when there's a fight, how do we communicate in a way that we still feel connected by the end of the day? So that's been huge for us. And in our own growth, we've learned a lot from being different in so many ways. Let me know if that answers the question as well, or if you have any follow-up question there. And another question, how did you decide when to have kids? That's been something that we both kind of knew we wanted. We did have conversations about it, but then the conversation was like, do we really want them? Because that's also something that we just see people have. People have kids, people get married and all of that. And the question almost became like, what do we want? And redefining the rules of our game. And in that, we had a conversation of, well, kids, yes, but when? Like, are we willing to be flexible in the timeline? Just like we were flexible with the timeline of getting engaged and getting married. And so I'd say we decided pretty early on that we would be open to having kids, because I know that can be a big deal breaker for a lot of people. But then the question was like, if I'm not able to have kids, or if you're not able to have kids, then what do we do? Are we still okay with being in this relationship? If I don't want to have kids right away, are we still okay with that? And so that became a choice of saying, yes, we're flexible to push that further down the line because we have other priorities. And if it never happens because of circumstances that we have no control over, then that's going to be it. But if we have the choice and if we can, then we will have kids. So let's say it was pretty early on, but it was more of that conversation. Timeline, what if we can't have kids? All of that, are we still okay with being in this relationship? And I think that really got us closer to go, how does the future look like and what are we willing to be open to? Hope that answered your question. Thanks for asking that. All right, thank you so much for being here. I hope these questions can guide you as much as I wish they had guided me in the past. And you can expect next videos to include a live Q&A, debunking popular myths, and other educational content as well for you to feel supported in your relationship. And I will link some resources in the description too. Have a great Sunday.